Okinawa, 1945. The war was ending, though no one on that island believed it yet. The air still smelled of iodine and ash. The wounded still filled the makeshift field hospitals that lined the shore. But one scene, witnessed by a captured Japanese nurse named Aiko Tanaka, would unravel everything she had been taught about mercy and enemies. She had been trained to expect humiliation. She had been told that Americans were brutes, men who would burn, defile, and mock before they killed. So when she was taken prisoner at dawn, still wearing her blood-stained armband, she braced for the worst. Instead, she was handed a cup of water. The man who offered it was tall, freckled, wearing a medic's patch with a red cross that looked too clean for the world around it. He didn't shout, didn't sneer. He simply said in slow, careful English, "Drink, please." Aiko hesitated, then took it. The water was cool, impossibly kind. Hours later, she found herself in the U.S. 24th Medical Battalion's field hospital, not as a patient, but as an observer, one of several Japanese nurses captured during the last week of fighting. They were kept apart at first, guarded but unharmed. Then, an American lieutenant approached them and said words that made no sense. "We need your help." Aiko thought she had misheard. "Help?" she repeated in halting English. The lieutenant nodded. "You're nurses. You know wounds. We have men, ours and yours. Too many for us to handle alone." It was madness. Collaboration was betrayal. Yet, that evening, she found herself standing beside American medics under a flickering tent lamp, stitching a wound on a Japanese soldier's arm while an American held the flashlight. The man holding the light, the same one who'd given her water, introduced himself quietly. Corporal Robert Hayes, Iowa. He didn't say enemy. He didn't say prisoner. Just a name. In the hours that followed, Aiko worked in silence. Every instinct told her to resist, to look away from the American stretchers that lay side by side with the Japanese. But the rhythm of the work was universal. Clean, bandage, suture, comfort. When one man moaned in pain, an American pilot with burns across his chest, Aiko reached instinctively for the morphine syringe. Hayes stopped her hand. "Wait," he said. "His pulse is weak. Too much and he's gone." She froze, realizing he wasn't doubting her competence. He was teaching her. She met his eyes for the first time and saw something that terrified her more than cruelty. Understanding. By midnight, the line between them had blurred. There were no flags in the medical tent, only the steady hum of humanity trying to survive itself. An older Japanese nurse, Sato, whispered to Aiko, "They treat our men. Even now, I don't understand it." Aiko whispered back, "Maybe they don't see enemies. Maybe they only see wounds." From across the tent, Hayes called out, "Hey, Doc! Need another set of hands!" And before she could think, Aiko stepped forward. It was automatic now, the duty of one healer answering another. They worked side by side on a soldier whose uniform was so torn it no longer revealed his allegiance. Hayes looked at her and said, "You're good." The compliment, small and sincere, made her chest tighten. No officer in her own army had ever said that. When dawn came, the battlefields outside were still littered with smoke and silence. But inside the tent, something extraordinary had happened. American and Japanese nurses, prisoners and medics, had performed 27 surgeries in one night. No one had slept. No one had asked which flag the blood belonged to. Colonel Donovan, the camp surgeon, stood at the center of it all. He looked around the tent, at the faces of men and women who, by all logic, should have despised each other, and said quietly, "If this isn't peace, it's the closest thing I've seen." Later, when the Japanese nurses were escorted back to their quarters, Aiko turned to Hayes. "You treat all," she said, struggling for words. "Enemy, friend." "Same," he nodded. "That's the oath." She frowned. "Oath?" He took a deep breath. "I swore to help anyone who's hurt. Doesn't matter who. That's medicine. You do the same." She didn't answer right away, because the truth, heavy and unbearable, was that she would have never been allowed to. That night, lying on her cot, Aiko stared at the canvas ceiling and whispered to herself, "We were taught to heal our own. They were taught to heal everyone." And for the first time she wondered who had truly won the war. The next morning she woke to a voice outside the tent. Hayes was there again, holding something in his hand. A small, tattered medical manual written in Japanese. "Found this in one of the supply boxes," he said. "Didn't seem right to throw it away." Aiko reached for it carefully, like a relic. "Thank you." He nodded, and said something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "War teaches us how to hurt. Maybe medicine is how we remember to stop." She looked down at the book, then back at the rows of bandaged men, Japanese and American alike. and realized she was witnessing something that history books would never record. Enemies keeping each other alive. And she knew, deep in her chest, that someday she would tell the story of the night she saw compassion wear both uniforms. Guam, late summer 1945. The war was over, on paper. But for Aiko Tanaka and the other Japanese nurses who had surrendered at Okinawa, the fighting still echoed in their bones. When the transport ship arrived at Naval Hospital Guam, the women stepped onto the dock wearing borrowed American uniforms, faded khaki dresses with Red Cross patches stitched clumsily where the Imperial emblem used to be. The American guards didn't sneer or shout. They simply directed them toward the medical tents and said, "You're needed." The word needed struck Aiko harder than any insult could have. She was a prisoner, yet somehow still useful. Inside the camp, life looked impossibly organized. Rows of clean white tents, supplies stacked neatly in wooden crates, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic instead of rot. It felt nothing like the chaos she had fled in Okinawa. Lieutenant Robert Hayes met them there, the same medic who had given her water on the day she was captured. His uniform was clean, but his eyes were rimmed red with exhaustion. "Welcome to Ward 14, he said. "We've got 70 patients. Some of them are yours." Aiko froze. "Ours?" "Japanese soldiers. Some American too. Here, we don't separate by flag." She looked at him in disbelief. "Even after surrender?" He nodded. "Especially after surrender." That first week was chaos wrapped in discipline. Aiko worked beside American nurses who taught her the rhythm of post-war medicine. Sterilization routines, triage systems, new antiseptics she had never seen. They didn't treat her like a traitor or a curiosity. They treated her like another pair of hands. At first, she copied their motions in silence, her English halting, her confidence brittle. But one night, when a young Japanese soldier began convulsing from infection, she acted on instinct, slapping the table to get attention, shouting in Japanese for water and cloth. The Americans rushed to her side. Hayes leaned in. "What are you doing?" "Lower fever," she said. "Quickly!" They followed her lead. Within minutes, the boy's breathing steadied. His temperature dropped. When it was over, Hayes clapped her gently on the shoulder. "You just saved him." "Good call, Nurse Tanaka." It was the first time he'd used her name with respect. For a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. Days turned into weeks. Aiko began teaching Japanese techniques, herbal compresses for burns, calming methods for delirium, while the Americans showed her penicillin, sterile gloves, and new surgical tools that looked like miracles forged from steel. Each side learned quietly from the other. In a corner of the ward, she started keeping a notebook. A mixture of English and Japanese words written side by side. Clean hands before compassion. Never decide who deserves help. One afternoon, she noticed an American nurse, Evelyn Brooks, watching her scribble. "What are you writing?" Evelyn asked. "Things I don't want to forget," Aiko replied. Evelyn smiled. "Then write this one down too." She took Aiko's pen and added in neat handwriting. "The body doesn't care about flags." Weeks later, a new kind of patient arrived. American pilots rescued from Japanese camps in Formosa. Some still bore the marks of captivity. Scars, sunken faces, eyes that flinched at sudden noises. When the Japanese nurses entered their ward, the silence was heavy. One pilot whispered, "You brought them here? After what they did to us?" Aiko felt every eye turn toward her. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the tent floor. But Hayes stepped forward. "These women saved lives at Okinawa. They're here because they believe in the same oath we do." He turned to Aiko. "Tell them in your words." Her throat tightened. "I was taught enemy deserves nothing, but I saw American doctor treat our soldiers same as his own. I cannot forget. I want to learn that way." For a long moment no one spoke. Then one of the pilots, older, his hands trembling, nodded. "Then maybe we can learn too." The tension broke like a fever. That evening, Aiko walked outside the ward and sat by the seawall. The ocean shimmered under the moonlight, as calm as if it had never known war. Hayes joined her, sitting a few feet away. "You know," he said softly, "some of our men still don't understand how I can work beside you." She glanced at him. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "My grandfather fought in the Great War. He told me once, 'Son, hating the enemy ends the war in your heart, not on paper.' I guess I'm still trying to finish mine." They sat in silence, listening to the waves and the distant hum of generators from the hospital tents. Aiko spoke first. "In my country, nurses swore to serve the emperor. You swore to heal all. I think yours is stronger." Hayes looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Maybe both are ways of serving something bigger than ourselves." But only one stops the bleeding. In the months that followed, Aiko became more than just a prisoner. She became a bridge. When Japanese POWs were too ashamed to speak to American doctors, she translated, not just words, but fear into understanding. When American soldiers recoiled at the sight of a Japanese face, she approached quietly, hands open, saying, "I only bring medicine." The barriers thinned, and somewhere between the sound of sutures and the smell of antiseptic, she realized that war had turned her into what peace needed most, a translator of humanity. By Christmas 1945, the Guam hospital had become an unlikely sanctuary. American and Japanese patients sang carols together. One evening, a nurse found Aiko kneeling by a bed, teaching a wounded American corporal how to write his name in Japanese characters. "What's that mean?" he asked, pointing to the word she'd written beside his name. "Peace," she said softly. "It's what this place feels like," he smiled. "Never thought I'd hear that word from someone in a khaki dress." She smiled back. "Never thought I'd say it." But peace was fragile. When the order came to transfer the Japanese medical personnel to a repatriation camp in the Philippines, the ward fell silent. The American staff gathered for a farewell that felt like the end of something sacred. Hayes found her in the supply room, folding the same medical manual she'd once carried through the battlefield. "You'll go home soon," he said quietly. "That's good." Aiko hesitated. "Home feels far away." He handed her a small Red Cross badge. "Keep this. Proof that for a few months you worked for humanity, not for flags." She took it with both hands and bowed deeply. "When I see wounded again," she said, "I will remember how you healed them. All of them." That night, as their transport ship pulled away from Guam, she stood on deck watching the lights of the American camp fade into the dark Pacific. Her heart felt split, half carrying the sorrow of her nation, half carrying something new she could not name. When she opened her notebook, the last line she wrote was simple. "I thought mercy was weakness, but I saw it save the world." And as the waves carried her toward Japan, Aiko understood that healing had no language, only hands that refused to stop trying. Tokyo, spring 1947. The city was still a skeleton of its old self. Steel ribs of half-burned buildings, open squares where neighborhoods once stood, silence where laughter had lived. But inside the Red Cross civilian hospital, life was returning one patient at a time. And among the nurses moving through its narrow halls, one face stood out. Not for its beauty, but for the calm that clung to her like a second uniform. Aiko Tanaka, former Imperial Army nurse, former prisoner of war, now wore a white cap bearing a tiny red cross. She was back home, but it didn't feel like home at all. When she first stepped into the new hospital, funded by the American Occupation Administration and staffed by both nations, her hands had trembled. Not from fear, but from memory. The rows of beds, the smell of disinfectant, the soft hum of generators. It was all too familiar. Except this time, she was free. A senior American officer had greeted her on her first day. "Miss Tanaka," he said, scanning her records. "You were trained in Guam under Lieutenant Hayes?" "Yes," she replied softly. "He taught differently." The officer smiled. "Good. We need that kind of difference here." Her first weeks back in Japan were strange collisions of worlds. She spoke English more fluently than some American nurses and Japanese more gently than she had before the war. Her patients were civilians, mothers, children, the old, people she had once ignored while serving soldiers. One afternoon, a boy with bandaged legs clutched her hand and whispered, "You're not like the other nurses. You smile." She hadn't realized she was. That night, she sat in the quiet dormitory, writing in the same notebook she had carried since Okinawa. Its pages were full of words that no longer fit into war. Kindness is not surrender. Healing is the only victory that lasts. An enemy's wound bleeds the same color. But even in peace, she faced suspicion. Some Japanese doctors whispered that she was tainted, too close to the Americans. One accused her openly in a staff meeting. "You bow to them too easily," he said bitterly. "You have forgotten who you are." Aiko met his gaze calmly. "If remembering who I am means forgetting what I learned, then I choose to forget." The room went silent. Even the American doctors stopped writing. No one challenged her again. Then, one morning, the past walked through the hospital doors. A convoy of military trucks arrived carrying American doctors, part of a joint medical exchange program. Aiko stood near the entrance as the officers stepped down from the lead vehicle, their uniforms sun-bleached from Pacific duty. And then she froze. Robert Hayes. older, leaner, with the same steady eyes that had once seen her as a nurse before seeing her as an enemy. Their eyes met for the first time in almost 2 years. He smiled. "You made it," she bowed slightly. "And you kept your oath." Over the next weeks, they worked side by side again. This time in a place without barbed wire. They trained new Japanese nurses together, teaching sterilization methods, modern techniques, and something deeper: empathy. One afternoon, Aiko watched Hayes teaching a class about triage ethics. He drew a rough circle on the board and wrote, "Compassion doesn't check uniforms." After class, she told him quietly, "You've turned your oath into a language." He chuckled. "And you're the one translating it." But the world outside their ward wasn't as forgiving. The memories of the war lingered like smoke. Some American soldiers refused treatment from Japanese nurses. Some Japanese patients spat on the ground when Americans entered their rooms. Aiko handled both with the same quiet firmness. When one American patient refused her care, she simply said, "If you wish, I can ask another nurse. But if you allow me, I will treat you like my own brother." He looked away, ashamed. "Just do what you need to do." When a Japanese woman cursed her for serving foreigners, Aiko replied, "My country asked me to heal. It never said who I should refuse." Her calmness disarmed anger. It was her new form of resistance. By 1948, word of the hospital's success spread across Japan. People began calling it the Hospital of Two Flags, a place where Americans and Japanese saved lives under the same roof. Children drew it in school books. Local papers called it a miracle born from ashes. One day, an American reporter interviewed Aiko and Hayes together. "Do you two ever think about the war?" he asked. Aiko smiled faintly. "Every day. That's why we work so hard to end it again. Inside people's hearts." As the years passed, the hospital became her world. She trained hundreds of young women who would go on to rebuild Japan's healthcare system. She taught them American medicine with Japanese compassion. And when they asked where she'd learned it, she would say, "In a place where mercy wore 2 uniforms." In 1952, on the 7th anniversary of Japan's surrender, a ceremony was held at the Tokyo Red Cross to honor international medical workers. Aiko stood beside Hayes as he presented her with a bronze medallion engraved with a single phrase, "For service beyond nations." When the applause faded, he turned to her. "You once told me you thought mercy was weakness," he said. She smiled, tears trembling in her eyes. "And you said mercy stops the bleeding." "You were right," he nodded. "So were you. It's stronger than any army." That night, after the ceremony, she walked alone through the quiet hospital corridors. Through an open window came the faint laughter of new nurses, American and Japanese, sharing tea, their voices indistinguishable in the dark. She opened her old notebook again, its pages yellow with age, and wrote her final line. "We were enemies who learned the same pulse. The world changed because we stopped counting wounds and started healing them." She closed it gently, placed it on the windowsill, and whispered into the warm Tokyo night, "Thank you, Corporal Hayes, for showing me what victory really means."